Excellencies, honored guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the South African Embassy in Germany. My name is Justin Kemp. I'm the First Secretary Political here at our embassy. And it's my honor to welcome you to today's event entitled Mapping Diplomatic Summits and African Foreign Policies in the Global Landscape. We believe that today's engagement will foster further fruitful discussions and set a tone for what we as current G20 presidency would like to achieve. With these brief words, it's my honor to welcome Dr. Ambimbola, Executive Director from the African Policy Research Institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was hoping you would spend a bit more time so I don't look like I'm going to fill my time up with stuff. But I've got a written statement here. I'm going to read it out. And then I'll invite Mr. Westhuizen to come after me. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a distinct pleasure to welcome you to this timely and important event titled Mapping Diplomatic Summits and African Foreign Policies in the Global Landscape. We're gathered here today, both in Berlin and virtually, thanks to the collaborative efforts of APRI, the Deutsche Afrika Stiftung, and the Embassy of the Republic of South Africa, for which I'm very grateful. The evolving geopolitical landscape presents African governments with unprecedented opportunities to diversify their international partnerships. The global push for clean energy, in particular, offers new avenues to advance Africa's industrialization and economic transformation. We are witnessing a clear surge in the number of Africa Plus One summits, a testament to the continent's rising diplomatic and economic significance on the global stage. This renewed interest from various global players, coupled with geopolitical rivalries, has sometimes been framed as a new scramble for Africa. However, this narrative often overlooks a crucial aspect: the proactive agency of African governments themselves. African nations are not merely passive recipients of foreign attention. They are actively leveraging these international engagements, agreements, partnerships to advance their own strategic objectives, whether it's to attract investment, reduce economic dependency, reclaim policy space, or overcome political isolation. Indeed, since the first France-Africa Diplomatic Summit in 1973, African countries have significantly diversified their partnerships, driven by concerns of security, of resource access, industrial development, and global power dynamics. The proliferation of Africa Plus One summits clearly reflects this diversification, with the European Union remaining a key, but no longer exclusive, if it ever really was, partner. This shift underscores the growing influence of new diplomatic actors, such as BRICS Plus nations, which are increasingly challenging traditional power structures. However, we must also acknowledge an inherent asymmetry in these summit formats. Too often, the diverse national positions of African countries are homogenized into a single voice, overlooking the nuanced perspectives of African policymakers and government politicians. Our aim today is to unpack this complex, multidimensional nature of African agency in international relations. This event also marks the official launch of APRI's interactive mapping of Africa Plus One summits. This innovative tool offers valuable insights into the evolving role of the African continent in global affairs, providing spatial and temporal analysis of topical trends, and will eventually track outcomes. We believe that by analyzing these summits collectively, we can gain a deeper understanding of how Africa's positioning can be leveraged to support its development and industrialization. During the discussion, we hope not only to explore the insights from the mapping tool, but also delve into Africa's aspirations and policies amidst geopolitical shifts and ongoing challenges to multilateralism. So I'm particularly glad that we're doing this together with the South African Embassy, given the G20 presidency at the moment. We look forward to highlighting diverse national perspectives on foreign policy priorities and adaptations in critical areas such as trade, industrialization, climate change, digital technologies, and critical raw materials. This session today is designed to foster dialogue and gather feedback from African experts, from policymakers, embassy representatives, German think tanks, representatives from CSOs, and the private sector. Your contribution are invaluable and will help us enhance the relevance and implementation of our mapping tool. We hope that the networking reception following the workshop will provide an excellent opportunity for meaningful exchange and lay the groundwork for future strategic collaborations between African and German stakeholders and between APRI, the Deutsche Afrika Stiftung, the embassy, and those of you in the room as well. Once again, welcome and thank you for being here. And now I give it over to you, Andres.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, Dr. Olumide Amembola, Ms. Sabina Odiambo, esteemed panelists, distinguished guests. It's an honor to the South African Embassy to co-host this event with our partners from Africa and the German Africa Foundation, and to allow a dialogue of growing urgency and enduring importance. In a world defined by increasingly by uncertainty, geopolitical shifts, climate pressure, and a technological upheaval, Africa's voice and vision in global diplomacy are more vital than ever. Today's conversations on mapping diplomatic summits and understanding the evolving architecture of African foreign policies are not just an academic exercise. They are a blueprint for how the continent navigates influence, asserts agency, and forges partnerships on its own terms. These discussions will help us illuminate the intersections of strategy, sovereignty, and solidarity. Dear Excellencies and participants, we are fully aware that the world faces a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape marked by intensifying global competition, shifting global alliances, contested norms, economic uncertainty, and growing geopolitical tensions. In this dynamic environment, we must ask ourselves, how do we position ourselves to navigate these challenges effectively? To address this, I will focus on the four following issues that I believe confronts all of us. Right-wing nationalism and ethnoculturalism. The resurgence of right-wing nationalism across various regions has intensified the discourse surrounding ethnic politics, revealing an urgent need for governance that prioritize inclusivity and representation. This trajectory may catalyze a swift departure from multilateral agreements, instead favoring a landscape dominated by bilateral trade deals prioritizing national interest only. Such a shift could significantly weaken international cooperation on critical global challenges, including climate change, arms control, and public health initiatives. As we navigate these challenges, it is crucial to tackle the underlying tensions that narrow nationalism generates, all while pushing for ideals of justice and equality for every citizen. This call for inclusivity is particularly relevant in the context of technological development. Technological developments, and you know that technology acts as a double-edged sword, offering economic growth and job opportunities while also posing threats like the digital divide and job displacements due to automatization. The need for investment in education and training to prepare the workforce for a digitized economy, therefore, remains crucial. International relations must consider addressing the dual challenges of narrow nationalism and technological disruption, as it is crucial for fostering a more equitable society. By ensuring that technological advancements benefit all members of society, rather than just a privileged few, we can work towards a future that prioritizes inclusivity and sustainable economic growth. International and regional conflicts. Conflicts in regions like the Sahel, Libya, Sudan, and the DRC highlight the interconnectedness of security and governance. The principle that there are no military solutions to complex political economic crises resonates throughout the region. Regional mechanisms, including the AU's vision to silence the guns, highlight the need for conflict prevention and mediation. South Africa's own commitment to regional stability is evident through its participation in peacekeeping operations and support for conflict resolution mechanisms. Fourthly, environmental degradation. Addressing environmental challenges, particularly climate change, is essential for sustainable development. South Africa's G20 presidency prioritized biodiversity, conservation, land degradation neutrality, sustainable chemicals and waste management, climate change mitigation and air quality improvement, and ocean governance to address global environmental challenges and accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. So what is South Africa's strategic approach to these multilateral engagements? I'm going to highlight 4 of them, focusing firstly on our principled foreign policy. South African foreign policy is grounded in non-alignment, adherence to international law, multilateralism, diplomacy, and a commitment to progressive Africanism and internationalism. Active engagement in international organizations like BRICS, the UN, the AU, the G20 underscores this commitment. Leveraging our membership in BRICS Plus. BRICS Plus membership provides access to funding and collaboration opportunities in key areas like research, innovation, energy, health, and education. Within these parameters, South Africa advocates for a reformed global governance system that respects sovereignty and it promotes equity. Our G20 presidency, you are aware that our presidency focuses on themes of solidarity, equity, and sustainability with an emphasis on African development. This presidency provides us with a platform to advocate for the global south and drive actionable solutions to interconnected crises. Fourthly, strengthening diplomatic ties with the European Union. South Africa and the European Union share a vital strategic partnership rooted in democracy, multilateralism, peace, and sustainable development, aimed at fostering global stability and prosperity for all. Engagement with the EU fosters a resilient economic framework and enhances South Africa's role in finding solutions for regional challenges. The EU's endorsement of South Africa's G20 presidents is much appreciated to help us address global challenges. Before concluding, allow me to briefly mention what the African Union has done to address global and African challenges. You would recall that COVID-19 responses, the AU, under the leadership then of President Cyril Ramaphosa, coordinated a continental-wide response through the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. It also established the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust and the Vaccine Delivery Task Team, helping securing and distribute nearly 1 billion vaccine doses. Health infrastructure, the AU has worked with the World Health Organization to accelerate health goals, including strengthening health systems and pandemic preparedness. Secondly, economic integration. One of the AU's flagship initiatives, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, aims to eliminate trade barriers and boost inter-Africa trade. It officially launched in 2021 and has been gradually operationalized with increasing participation from member states. In terms of peace and security, the AU has continued its efforts to mediate in conflicts and support peacekeeping missions in regions like the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and the Great Lakes. It has also taken a firmer stance against unconstitutional changes of government suspending member states following coups. Climate change and environmental action, the AU has positioned itself as a unified voice in global climate negotiation, advocating for climate justice, and increased financing for adaptation and mitigation in Africa. It also promoted renewable energy initiatives and sustainable development practices. Youth and gender empowerment. The AU has also advanced programs focusing on youth employment, entrepreneurship, and women empowerment, aligning with its Agenda 2063 goals. These include training initiatives, innovation hubs, and gender parity campaigns. Global diplomacy and representation. The AU successfully lobbied for a permanent seat at the G20, enhancing Africa's voice in global economic governance. It has also strengthened partnerships with the EU, China, and the US, and other global actors through strategic dialogues and cooperation frameworks. The above steps speak about Africa's own approaches to contribute to the global and continental challenges we face. In conclusion, it is my hope that our discussions here today will not only be a reflection of Africa's dynamic engagement with the world, but a catalyst for reshaping global dialogue with Africa, not as a passive participant, but as a strategic partner shaping the future. We need to be more resilient, apply more visionary thinking, and become even more innovative to navigate the complex geopolitical landscape. And never forget that through mutually respected partnerships, we could address our challenges better. I am therefore looking forward to the presentations to be made here today and the discussions to be conducted. I thank you.
I'm a bit short. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to those of you joining us in-house and those of you also joining us online. We are pleased that you could make time to join us for all this very important conversation. As the speeches before me has emphasized, over the past 2 decades, Africa has become, if I dare say, one of the most diplomatically courted regions in the world. And this enhanced diplomatic profile reflects the deeper shifts, as we've already heard, in geopolitical alliances, in economic competition, and global development architecture. This visibility reached a milestone in 2023 when the African Union became a permanent member of the G20. This, along with South Africa's G20 presidency, I believe, places African leadership squarely at the heart of global governance. But how do we harness this for our development needs? The continent, as we've seen, now engages in a number of summits every year with traditional partners and with emerging partners, be it the AU Summit, FOCAC, India or Africa forums. These summits, I believe, have become critical theaters where agendas are negotiated. But whilst we've seen an increase in volume, there are still questions. The two speakers before me raised some of those questions. Essentially, beyond the communiques and photo ops, what tangible outcomes can we actually say have yielded for African economies? And what are the gaps between rhetorics and reality? What new approaches do we actually need to move from summit diplomacy and declarations into actual gains? Hopefully, the session that we'll be going through will help us understand these questions. And again, I am more interested in the role of the private sector in all this. So, housekeeping. The event is being recorded, and we encourage our online participants to share their comments and questions in the YouTube chats. Your cameras and microphones are muted. And in-person attendees can share their comments and questions during the Q&A session that we'll have at the end of the panel discussion. So, we are going to start the discussion with a presentation from Dr. Amandine. She is the head of geopolitics and geoeconomics at APRI. Her presentation will provide a visual overview of diplomatic ties between African countries and their partners, both traditional and emerging, and it would also highlight the growing number of countries that have hosted these summits so far. Amandine, you have the floor.
Thank you. Obviously, I would like to start also to thank the South African Embassy, Mike, Sabine, the German African Foundation, and all my colleagues for organizing the event today. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And thank you for all of us. I know it's very warm outside, but thank you for joining us today. Actually, we started this idea of having a mapping of diplomatic summits when we start with this idea of, okay, what do we mean by African foreign policy? What do we mean about bringing African voices out? Because this is one of the ideas we had with APRI. This is what we want to do. And then with my team, we just ask ourselves what kind of concrete things we can do in the current geopolitical context. So this is just now the first step for this tool. So that's why I will be happy to collect your feedback. Feel free to share any thought you can have on this one. This is really the first step for this. So I will start with just connecting the dots with what Olomide said, the geopolitical aspect. Also, definitely the green and clean energy transition and why it's now Africa is becoming more and more, and key actors for the rest of the world. And actually, we started also in January by launching a mapping on African partnerships in minerals with their external partners. And then we also realized that these partnerships are not coming from scratch. There is an overall diplomacy around this. So we can talk about climate diplomacy, but diplomacy broader than climate. So this is why we said, okay, we should maybe look at the summits. What are the key questions, the core areas that African states want to discuss with their counterparts? What kind of different topics are relevant and how we can classify them? And for us, it was also interesting to connect these aspects also with the broad reflection about African agency. And I would say, what about this idea of African agency? Usually, African agency is defined as the freedom and capacity of African actors to identify, define, and pursue their interest within the global environment. But most of the time, we know that Africa gain significant geopolitical weight and greater self-confidence at the world stage, and also they want to pursue strategic autonomy. But the question for us with this mapping is that how can these summits can actually meaningfully support African agency? How they can enhance the continent's influence worldwide? So it's really important to ask this question, because if we want to amplify the African voice, if we want to better understand the agenda, and also not to say that this is all the agenda is shaped by outside actors, we need to understand us. We need to understand the continent. This mapping is about governments, but we can also look at the civil society organization. We can also look at the private sector. So that's why we're going to have different voices during the roundtable. But this is also why we decided to clarify exactly, conducting this mapping, how we can say about diplomacy and what we can say about foreign policies in Africa. So this is actually the methodology we used. It's very basic, meaning that we scope first the research, and then we conduct data collection. We use all were open sources. We want to use the statements from African embassies, but also from their partners. And then we decided to compile more than 60 summits. And we detail, and you will see on the mapping, the dates, the content, and also the link to the declaration. And then we decided to map these summits. And the idea now is to continually to update this map with the different summits to make sure that it's always up to date, and then everyone can use this as a database on a regular basis. The idea was that definitely we have the idea of African voice is also at the global stage. We can talk about the African Union, but our idea is also to think about, okay, but usually we said Africa. Africa, since Africa was very homogeneous, was a bloc. So that's why we could also cover the African Union with this mapping, but we decided to really have this interest in specific countries, because all the countries are different. They have this specific strategy, specific agenda, specific objectives. So this is why we started at the government or state level. And this is also why you won't see the EU, the European Union, because there is so many also summit between EU, but also between Latin America and Africa, or Arab states and Africa. So, but we really wanted to start with something very simple, and then obviously building on your comments, we will see what we can do for the next step. So Africa is not a block, it's not a single block, it's really different entities and different histories, different realities. So this is really, we want to avoid this caveat and this risk. So now with this work, our goal is really to delve deeper into African foreign policy and also to understand how African states engage with the world and how they can leverage this summit to do it. I would not say it was an easy task, because as you can imagine, we are talking about diplomacy. The statements are not so easy to find, and they're also very broad, very vague, sometimes very opaque. So it was a challenge. So now I would say what we'd like to do as a next step is also to open the discussion with some of the diplomats and actors, and then the kind of information they can provide, and just to also to confirm that the data we collected are the right one, to make sure that we have accurate data for this mapping. So this is also why we also wanted to open the floor and collect your feedback, especially on this one. So this is finally the output, and now I'm going to just give you a brief overview of the mapping. Okay, so there is different possibility to use it. You can definitely, click here, and you can see the trend is really interesting, meaning that from the 60s, the 70s to the 90s, most of the summits were between France and Africa. And then we see progressively also more place for China, and then for India, for Indonesia, and then Russia, and more recently South Korea. And this is really interesting to see the trends, and we wanted to see the trends over time, also to check what is the role the European actors, but also the other actors are playing in this summit. And we can definitely see that the 2024 was really the year of the summit for Asia. You saw South Korea, China, Indonesia. So obviously we talk about this new scramble in Africa. This is true and not really true, but the true is about that we have a lot of actors, especially Asian actors, who want to counter the Chinese influence on the continent. They want to develop their specific relationship with a couple of African countries, and this is why you see more and more Asian countries on the continent. But we didn't want to stop there, and that's why we really want to have this mapping also to make sure that what is behind and what is the real what is attractive for this African country to host the summit with these Indonesian countries. So this is also something we wanted to cover. And I would say that also the question is now about the BRICS, also the role, because we can also definitely see this country as an entity, but also as a small group, small specific countries. So the next step for us will be then to question the groups, the coalitions, and also the role a couple of African states are playing within groups. So again, the next step for this mapping will be to think in terms of coalition. How do we see the coalition behind this summit? This is also something really important. And the last thing we would like to do is also to track and monitor. And this question was key already when we start with the CRM mapping. We have so many declarations, so many statements, so many partnerships, but concretely what's going on? And how the African agenda is playing a role to shape the implementation of this partnership or the decision made So this is something we would like to develop. So we're gonna just again brainstorm inside within the team and to see what kind of methodology we can develop on that. But this is a really concrete way to also track and monitor to what extent really this summit and this diplomacy is helping African countries to shape their agenda and to support their strategies. So maybe I can stop here. Just the floor will be open during the Q&A. If there is any question on the mapping more specifically, please use it again and again. Just let us know what you would like to do with it. The idea again is really to make sure that we can support your work, we can do something concrete. At this stage, it's really a database. We want to have this really friendly, user-friendly. This is why we did it this way. But this is really interesting. And just also I mentioned to show a couple of things. So when you click on the country, that's why I was mentioning that it's a database, is because you can see on the chronological order also the kind of summits organized by the different country, the dates, the thematics actually discussed during the title of the summits. And what we hope to do is also to categorize a couple of thematics which were discussed during these summits. And this also to compare in terms, if we talk about energy, if we talk about security, if we talk about a couple of sectoral aspects or issue, what are also the most active partners to support Africa? This is also something we're going to track, and more concretely, it's going to be the next step for the mapping. So I will stop there. Was just to present the mapping. This is really the official launch, and now I'll give you the floor to you, Serva, and then going back to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Amandine. Now we'll dive into the panel discussion. We are privileged to have 4 experts who have graciously agreed to dialogue with us, and now I would welcome them. First, we have Mr. Karim El Shabab. He's a counselor at the Egyptian Embassy here in Berlin. He is in charge of African affairs, trade and investment at the embassy as well. Before joining the embassy in Berlin, he served at the Egyptian Embassy in Algiers and Pretoria. Welcome, Mr. Karim. Next, we have Dr. Rose Ngugi. Dr. Rose Ngugi is a fellow at the Robert Bosch Foundation. She's the chairperson of the Southern African Voice. She also serves as a member of the Italian Institute of Political Studies Advisory Board. She is also a guest editor of the Journal of African Development and a co-chair of Think 20 South Africa Task Force 1 on trade and investment. She is the former executive director of the prestigious Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis, KIPRA. Welcome, Dr. Ngugi. Thank you. Third, we are joined by Mr. Azwin Langala. He is a fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He is a trade and investment law and policy advisor. He also advises governments and private sector on how they can respond to the dynamic geopolitical and geoeconomic environment. Welcome, Mr. Langala. Thank you. Finally, we have Ms. Kadi Kamara. She's the Deputy Head of Countries and Markets and Senior Manager in charge of Anglophones West Africa and Lusophones Africa at the Africa Ferrari. Thank you very much. Are we ready? So for the first round, as Amandine mentioned in her presentation, I would want us to focus on feedback. We've seen the map, it was shared ahead with us. We've also had time to look at it. We want to hear your feedback and reflections. More specifically, how are tools like this mapping going to improve our understanding of African diplomacy? And again, how can we enhance it to be able to support the individual portfolios that you handle more broadly? So I'll start with Karim.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here today. I first want to start out by thanking the Embassy of South Africa for hosting this event, and for APRI for the great work they've done on the mapping tool. My name is Karim El Khasheb. I'm a counselor at the Egyptian Embassy here in Berlin. It's really special for me to be in the South African Embassy today. I served, before serving in Berlin, in Pretoria for 4 glorious years, enjoyed every single moment of it. So that's why it's really, really special for me to be here with our South African colleagues. As I said, I really want to thank APRI for the tool, the mapping tool that they have created. It really puts this issue into perspective. It's been going on, as they mentioned, for quite some time, but this mapping shows us a little bit more where the focus has been and where the focus is shifting and where the focus is going. But allow me to start perhaps by echoing our South African colleagues' comments in the beginning about the state of global affairs at this time. I think looking back over the past 10 or 20 years, this is perhaps the most difficult time it has been to do what we've termed African diplomacy, given the very large, very times severe and abrupt geopolitical changes that have been going on in the world. Whatever one may think about the multilateral system and the rules-based order and all its shortcomings, it did provide, especially African diplomacy, a platform to use to advocate for African issues. And what seems to be the withdrawal of multilateralism and in favor of more ad hoc decision-making and institutions, or a more realpolitik approach to foreign policy that major powers seem to have, in our view, provides a great disadvantage to African diplomacy and African efforts at expressing a common African position. There are opportunities, of course, there for Africa to try and use this moment to its advantages, but from our perspective, it would take a rethinking of how we approach things and how we approach other powers and other continents in the world to try to see how best to utilize this moment. But there's no doubt that a withdrawal of a rules-based international order and of multilateralism is something that ultimately will be disadvantageous to all the work that we as African countries have been doing really since independence to this day. It is also important to point out that whether in these forums, these Africa +1 forums, or in multilateral forums, the key here is what happens on the African continent first. The key here is the coordination that we do within the continent, whether at the regional level, at the different regions in Africa, or at the AU level. As was mentioned before, the continent is definitely not one thing, and there are multi-layered interests all throughout the continent, and at times those interests don't exactly see eye to eye. But there is a common denominator there. Reaching that common denominator for the African continent must always be the point with which we start, the point with which we approach others outside the continent, or issues such as climate change, such as investment, such as peace and security. Without those common African positions, going to these summits would not be nearly as effective for the continent and for the countries on the continent. And to be completely frank, we do face often challenges, not in the summit itself, but in the preparation to these summits. And that's something that we need to, I think, address openly and frankly, and see how best to develop mechanisms to not just reach these African common positions, but maintain them and implement them and voice them as one. But as dangerous as the moment we are in today for African diplomacy, it also provides opportunities. Many of the challenges facing the world, especially facing Europe, a lot of those answers would be in the continent itself, would be in Africa. So if there's a challenge of demographics, if there's a challenge of opening new markets, of nearshoring, of, like I said, of energy, especially of clean energy, many of the answers to the questions that many around the world are asking would be found in the continent. And that should be the way we approach these summits or multilateral forums in general. That the continent is here not just to ask for assistance or for technology transfer or for development aid, all of these things being absolutely legitimate and needed, but that the continent represents an important and integral part of the world's future as a whole. And I think many powers in the world see that and recognize that. And looking at the map and looking at the increased frequency of these summits, it's quite clear that there is a recognition of that. It is important when we are framing that common African position that it begins from that point, that the continent provides, not just looks for solutions for its problems in cooperation with others, but that it can provide solutions to others to the challenges that the world is facing. I would also like to very briefly and lastly touch on this idea that yes, these political summits are important, but what is equally important and can perhaps be even more fruitful is engagement with global private sector as well, from African private sector and also from African governments. In our engagement with the private sector here in Germany and in Europe at large and in other parts of the world as well, the question we're often asked in Egypt is, yes, there is a favorable investment environment in Egypt, but global companies don't just look at countries individually. They look at creating value chains across regions and even across the continent. And the more effort we do in connecting African countries economically, increasing intra-African trade, the more attractive investment would be in the African continent, and the better the negotiating position we would have, not just vis-a-vis other governments, but vis-a-vis the global private sector as well. And it'll be interesting to see if we could map as well how that engagement between the continent and global capital has been. I want to thank you again for this panel here today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rose, we have 3 minutes for your general feedback.
Okay.
Quick, short and sweet.
All right, so thanks very much for inviting me here today. I know it was a very short notice, but I decided that it's important to come and see what is going on as far as mapping diplomatic relations is concerned. And I would want to say that is a very, very important effort. As the presenter has said, it's providing data. And you know, when you have data, you actually are able to plan effectively. But at this point, I just want to say 2 things. One is that Africa looks like it embraces everybody who wants to partner with it. At multilateral level, it's part of the G77. It's also part of the G24. And of course, as indicated, the G20 now, which means that it embraces partnership in development. For the various countries that have managed to have this relationship, you'll find that they also tend to be part and parcel of these setups, whether it's in BRICS, whether it is in a G20, or whether it is in the other forums, which means that it provides quite a big space for Africa to network and to partner with the world. But critically is to ask, what is it that we are using for this networking? What agenda? What strategy? What is it that we are doing with them? Because if you look at China, it may be having a very different document that they are using with us to do the engagement. If you go maybe to Russia, you go to South Korea and the like, and they will all give us different areas of interest. In some situations, it's interest for both of us, but we can also deny interest also for the other side. But of interest is to ask whether African countries go there with an agenda for Africa, or they also go there with an agenda for themselves, and at the end of the day, how we coordinate the various layers of the agenda that we take to this summit. Is, say, for example, you're going to China. China has an interest in climate change. You come back and you ask yourself, does Africa have actually a climate change agenda? And is what that is being discussed actually part and parcel of the climate change strategy that AU has actually set aside? So that at the end of the day, we should be able to see where is the engagement, say, with South Korea or with Italy, where is it feeding in as far as the AU 2063 is concerned? Because I would feel good to know that while everybody is talking about energy transition, everybody is talking about, no, we are going to support you with the renewable energy, we are going to do solar, we are going to do wind, we are going to support you in all these things. It's important to ask, what do you put on the table? So country A maybe has taken us just halfway, or country B has taken us only 1%, or country C is taking us only 3%. So if we have this target set, how are we able to engage in totality so that the support that could be coming is able to push the agenda that we have set for ourselves? And then finally is to just ask the team whether in this mapping, are you putting a kind of a monitoring tool in it, yeah? Just to see, or to help even researchers to see whether you can actually tell where this is taking you. Is this engagement actually pushing us anywhere, maybe to close the various gaps that we have, whether it's in poverty, in energy, whether it's poverty, in digital transformation, or in all this? Are we able to link it up somewhere so that it is not just this is the way we are engaging, but at the same time we are able to kind of see either an outcome of what is going on as far as the engagement is concerned. So an inbuilt kind of monitoring tool that sees us going forward. And then also finally is to ask whether it is an open source, because coming from a think tank world, the first thing that you want to see is you have data that is accessible and you can manage to utilize it to do your research work or to actually evidence whatever is going on. So I would want just to request that it is made an open source. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope I've done 3 minutes.
Almost. As we please would like to hear from you as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Azumpele Langalanga. I'm a visiting research fellow at the SVP. But in my daily life, when I'm not visiting, I'm an independent researcher. So the views that I'm going to share, they are more aligned with my, when I'm not visiting.
Duly noted.
Yes, yes. Thanks a lot, APRI and the South African Embassy for inviting me to be here today. And I think the tool can be used to take stock of what has been happening in these summits in the past. But I also think at the same time, maybe from a philosophical perspective, it is the tool as you undertake this study is to also look at the idea of something that has been bothering me for some time is this, is there anything called an African diplomatic culture? Because this for me talks also to this idea of summits, which once you say it's a summit and you say it's a meeting, the expectations of the outputs are different. So maybe that is why some of these summits, if not most of them, have not really yielded concrete results because summits tend to be high level, and normally we don't expect concrete results from a summit. It's different. Let's say you have a NATO meeting and you know you're going to come up with something. So I think the tool itself can be used to then inform the policymakers in different African countries and also the institutions that are building blocks to these African countries. Because ultimately, if we are to expect concrete stuff to come from the summits, we expect all the stakeholders to have had an input in the preparation of the summits, so that when they come back also, that's how we can hold the governments to account to say what came out of FOCAC, what came out of the Japan-Africa summit. So I think it will be important if the tool can be used to inform the different stakeholders. And also it will be good to look at what has been the continuities and discontinuities of these summits since 1979, because then that also gives you a picture of how Africa is viewed from outside by its partners. Because ultimately, I think as we sit here, the Africa Plus summits, these are really not African summits per se. These are partner summits with Africa. Because if I invite you for a meeting, I'm the one who kind of tells you why I invited you for a meeting. So it's it will be. I think the structure also itself kind of it talks to why there have been summits. It will be good also in the tool to see what have the partners themselves been able to actually get out of the summits at a concrete level. Because you might find that whereas on our side, they are more ceremonial. On the other side, there might be summits that actually inform concrete results. Thanks.
Kadi, 3 minutes.
Yes, I'll try to stick to the time. Thank you also from my side. As a representative for businesses here, I could say their summits are very useful and are very unuseful. This map is very useful because it underlines what our association and other stakeholders have said for a long time. Diplomacy and political engagement is super important also for private sector engagement, because you could use this map and look at foreign direct investment in Africa and you will see that will match. So why is Germany not on there, and why is Germany such a small part of foreign direct investment? Maybe because the diplomatic summits have not happened as much. That would be one part, and maybe one thing that the tool can do to underline these facts. And as a business, and I love that you from the Egyptian embassy said the interaction with international business is so important. Why we think they are useful is because you can create political momentum around specific topics that private sector is also involved in. So if there are structural issues that prohibit companies from investing in the country, if now France is doing an investment a summit, a political summit with African countries, you can underline these things and actually try and solve. And because political stakeholders always want something to show for, when there's a summit coming, they usually start working while they have been ignoring you for a long time. So that is the political summits and diplomacy is useful. The unuseful is, as soon as the diplomatic summit is over, the attention is on the next summit that maybe concerns a different region or different topics. And I think that is the big threat, and that's why there are these two sides. And lastly, I would also underline the last point. I think we should focus maybe more, and maybe that's something the tool can also do, on what summits is Africa as African Union or as even regional organizations actually initiating, where they set the agenda and somehow invite and say, we want to talk to you about this and that, and that's a good way to see who's interested and who takes the priorities of the African continent actually as something that they want to meet. And maybe that would be a next step also for the mapping. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting insights. Karim, in your earlier submission, what caught my attention was you emphasized how difficult diplomacy has become, or the times that we are in. We need to re-strategize. But I'm more interested in the current approach. Given Egypt's extensive network, diplomatic network, you are also members of BRICS. And so looking at the regional and continental level from the AU perspective, how would you characterize Egypt's diplomatic approach and engagement in those forums? And to what extent does it reflect the broader African diplomacy, if there is a broader African diplomacy that you can imply from? What lessons can we learn from Egypt's engagement in these forums? Any challenges and opportunities? You mentioned a few, but any that you can emphasize for us to learn from you?
Thank you very much. So on this issue, is there African diplomacy? There are African common positions. We do the African common positions that we develop either first and primarily at the AU level, but that we develop in other multilateral forums as well. They have to do with a wide-ranging amount of topics, whether it's UN Security Council reform, or whether it's issues of peace and security, like non-proliferation, or it's on humanitarian issues, or a whole host of those issues. And Egypt, we would like to think, plays an integral part in creating those African common positions, because we know that when we take those then to a broader global stage, it allows us to act much more effectively and to gain more gains for the continent as a whole. So there are African common positions, and they guide the work that we do in the forums, whether or not we are speaking on behalf of Africa or we are engaging in a more bilateral sense. As I said, creating those African common positions is challenging. And often, and when we speak honestly, in multilateral forums or even in some of these summits, when we enter with this common position, it sometimes doesn't survive different phases of negotiations. And we find it collapsing sometimes quite quickly, and sometimes from only a few actors within the African continent, where there's a broader consensus. But consensus means everybody has to be on board. And obviously that is a very difficult thing, not just in the African continent, but the EU will tell you the same thing, that it's hard to reach consensus, especially on more thorny issues. But we have noticed that in the African continent, it has been perhaps a greater challenge, and that weakens our engagement with other actors. As for Egypt, as for the African continent as well, this changing global political dynamic provides not just challenges, but also provides, like I said, opportunities. And the more we are able to see the spaces that it creates and the leverage that it gives the African continent and African countries, as I said, both bilaterally in their engagement with other countries, but also collectively, the more we will be able to successfully navigate the climate that we are in. I want to go back as well, just very briefly, on this issue of the withdrawal of multilateralism and how much really of a danger that is for the African continent as a whole. Again, despite all the reservations you may have on this multilateral system, it has provided a platform for African countries to advance their interests. And I would say, especially in the UN system, on the whole, African countries have done so really successfully. I think of issues like climate change and climate change negotiations, and how with each and every COP, with each and every summit that has been, the African continent's voice has been raised. And it's not just, like I said, vying for African positions or African interests, but providing solutions for global challenges as a whole. And as important as these summits are, and they do provide an opportunity for political engagement at a very high level, and they also open doors for investment, they cannot be seen as substitutes for the global multilateral system. For a whole array of reasons, but this rules-based order really, in our opinion, provides the best platform for African countries to express their interests and defend them. These summits could be effective in certain sectors, like I said, with trade and investment, or if we have commonalities with the +1 countries on certain issues, then we could focus them, and then perhaps there's something to be said about making these summits more focused and not having to cover everything under the sun. Maybe that could be more effective. But in any case, they cannot be seen as substitutes for
multilateral gatherings.
Engagement.
Thank you very much. It's interesting that you mentioned COP, because whenever I hear COP, I hear $100 million that is yet to be fulfilled. So we'll segue now to Rose, into climate change, the all-important cross-cutting development issue. And it's interesting that Karim made an example of that in his submission. When it comes to climate change, at the intersection of climate change and the urgency for us now to deliver sustainable economic transformation, how are the geopolitical rivalries playing out at this nexus? Is it creating any influence? Are we seeing any gains? I'll be interested to know, especially the impact, since you raised it in the earlier session, that we should be able to see or follow through the promises. Do you have any case studies to share as well on this?
Okay, thank you so much. When I look at the area of climate change, as I've indicated, we need to show how different layers actually work together, and for a very fruitful discussion as far as for this Africa One Summit are concerned. I think the starting point would be to ask whether Africa as a continent is approaching them from what I would say non-strategic or strategic position. Strategic position meaning that you are either guided by what you want to achieve for the region. We know that we have the AU Agenda 2063, which tries to spell out clearly the priority areas that Africa want to see in economic transformation agenda. But in addition to that, we know that each country is also expected actually to to bring in those priority areas to their local development plans. So in that regard, it becomes very important to see in this summit what emphasis are we making for what I would call things like public goods. Say, for example, you're talking about such projects like the Grand Iga Dam, or you are focusing on the high-speed maybe transportation project, which touch beyond one country, but at the same time, since it's cutting across various countries, then the issue of geopolitical issues across the various countries also become very critical. I was trying to go through the Grand Iga Dam, and what you find is that the political situation in DRC Congo has been a factor that has affected the investment in that project, and it has gone to a situation where you find some partners actually pulling out. And that in itself is not a very good show of a situation where you have already moved forward towards negotiating for a project, and you want to see it benefiting not just one country, but benefiting more than one country and addressing a key developmental issue in the region. So, those two are key, what I would call like a cross-continent kind of projects that we need to ask, how do we go about securing them and ensuring that we remove the investment risk so that we can attract investors. But in addition to that is that during this summit, you also see situations where individual countries are also negotiating for individual projects that are going on in their country. And for me, that's where it becomes very, very tricky to see how you balance between pushing the whole agenda for Africa forward and pushing an agenda for an individual country. And of course, we know that all countries are not the same. The other element also to think about is how do you channel financing for some of these projects? I know we have, for example, the African Climate Change Fund, which is under the ADB, African Development Bank. And of course, it started small, but it's attracting quite a number of other development partners to put some of their funding through there. But then you ask yourself, when Africa is then going to COP, going to these other tables where climate financing is being discussed, how do you link the two levels of engagement such that you see the basket that you want to fill for financing is actually moving to the direction that you are looking at, and you are able to achieve your goal. Talk about the energy transition, and you'll find that you know, they say we have mobilized a lot of resources for renewable energy. But when you come to Africa, where we want to see energy transition moving in very fast, it's say that we are just getting maybe only 15% or less of the total amount of investments that are going to renewable energy. So that aspect of financing those things that we are able to agree on during the summits also becomes very crucial. I was checking some of the agreements or kind of plans that we have made, and you'll see, for example, I think I was looking at Saudi Arabia. It's able to give you, you know, this is the amount of money that I'm going to spend, this amount of money that I'm going to give in this amount of money I'm going to give. And then you look at another country, and then you'll find that they're just giving a statement of we are going to be in this space, we are going to be in this space, but it's not very clear the commitments that are there. So in a nutshell, trying to then get a clear picture of the financing, even at climate level, and looking at it vis-a-vis the bigger basket becomes very difficult. And then coordination of activities, as I had said earlier. So you'll find, for example, and I'll give an example with the Great Green Wall. So we have this Great Green Wall, and the UN WFP has been really at the forefront of it. And then, of course, China is also coming in, and in itself, its action plan, it also says that the Great Green Wall is actually is a priority for it. So the next question then you ask yourself is how China and the UN will be able to coordinate themselves actually to address that kind of a project which Africa puts as a priority. So all these issues become very critical. Geopolitical rivalries outside the continent may also bring in aspects of redirecting financial resources. We saw that when Ukraine-Russia war came in, and we saw some of the funding that was flowing to the region actually being cut. And that in itself has implications in terms of the speed at which the projects that have been agreed on can move. So I think that's what I would say. But also to recognize that, yes, there are systems that have already been put even under AU. There is an agenda even at AU level. The African group of negotiators has been at the forefront, talking about the global goal for adaptation. But when you look at the space within which that is discussed, it's discussed at the UNFCCC, the COPS level, But then you need also to ask yourself, how far do you go with that agenda at these bilateral relationships? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, zooming out of the sectorial focus back into the general foreign policy landscape in pursuit of a coordinated foreign policy approach. Given the geopolitical landscape that we are in now, and we hear a lot that international partnerships are diversifying, from where you sit and in your work, whether privately or as a fellow, what are the political and institutional obstacles preventing African partners from pursuing this coordinated foreign policy approach? Again, with their long-standing partners and also the new emerging partners. And again, looking at the enlargement of BRICS to include new African partners, how is that playing out so far?
Thanks a lot. I think from an institutional perspective, the issue is maybe lack of capacity, in the sense that the institutions that we have, the African Union and the regional economic communities, in the main, they do not have enough capacity to, I think, to engage at the level of these summits from a concrete policy level. But also the other issue is that, and I think it has been touched earlier by colleagues, is the issue of having divergent national interests because these summits, they are a culmination of foreign policy interests from both a commercial and economic interest perspective. So normally what you would expect is that if you go at a domestic level, you find policies, foreign policies that talk to the interests of the different countries. But what you find in some countries, generally you find that there is no a coherent foreign policy internally inside the country itself. So then that means even at a regional economic level, there is not a coherent regional interest. I'm talking about concrete interest, not at a very high level perspective. I think this then is transposed into these summits. This lack of coherence is the one that gets transposed to the summits. But where we are now with the sort of the fragmentation in the multilateral system, there is an opportunity to kind of address some of these challenges, in the sense that because when we talk about multipolarity, we are going back to the regions, where the idea is that there must be some level of regional powers. So if you go to Southern Africa, maybe that will be South Africa. If you go to West Africa, that could be Nigeria. In East Africa, that maybe is Kenya. Then they have their own spheres of influence. Then you would expect that going forward, these countries are able then to rally their own regions to get that coherence, which then can be transposed first at the AU level, then later on at the summit level outside. Then when it comes to, I think also at a political level, one of the challenges is the Agenda 2063. In that if you are meeting with the other partners and you use Agenda 2063 as a sort of as a benchmark, the other partner is, because it looks like it's very far into the future and no one in the room will be held accountable for anything that is linked to that. There is a possibility, or it might make the other partners not have concrete promises or concrete stuff that they give to you. Then when it comes to the BRICS, so the enlargement of BRICS in principle is very good, because it then increases the agency of African countries in that group. But in my own view, it will be good if I go back to this issue of multipolarity and having the regional powers themselves being in the BRICS, but also having a coherent or a coherent or a group idea of what as African partners in the BRICS want. Because what we've seen so far in practice is that I think this was in Brazil when foreign ministers from Egypt and Ethiopia, they kind of, there were reports that came from that summit that South Africa, because it wants a permanent seat in the UNSC, this time around, when the Brazilians wanted to put that in the communique, they couldn't, because apparently they were opposed by Egypt and Ethiopia. So you will see that that incoherence inside the BRICS. So what you find outside the BRICS in the continent gets now transposed into the BRICS, which for me is a challenge. Then one wonders if then maybe the expansion itself, maybe it was premature, or we could have a situation where South Africa remained as the African country represented, with interests of other African countries being channeled through South Africa to ensure a level of coherence. And maybe the last point is this issue of what the academics say is the Kissinger question. Who do I call? Apparently Kissinger said, who do I call in Europe if I want to talk to Europe? The question remains in Africa. If one wants to talk to Africa, who do they call? Do they call South Africa, or they call Nigeria or Egypt or Ethiopia, or the bureaucrats in the AU? And I think also this kind of presents a challenge also at a summit level. Thanks.
Thank you. Now let's bring in the private sector. The map didn't really cover them at this stage, but I was happy you brought it up earlier, that there is engagement before the summit, but after the summit, everything dies. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts on the connection between diplomacy, trade, and the private sector. Are there any opportunities there in the context of these summits and the geopolitical rivalries? And again, is the private sector the missing link to translating aid to trade? Africa Beyond Aid. Is the private sector the missing link?
I have to say yes.
Okay. Resounding yes.
And I want to bring in the example of money that goes into the African continent, for example, for tackling climate change. All the money that goes to countries that is being promised, if private sector cannot make it into projects, this money is not worth anything. So if the vehicles to bring in the money are not right, if the general environment in the countries is not right to, for example, develop renewable energy projects, then the money is worthless. So at the end of the day, we always end up at the governments can talk about whatever they want to. If they don't have the private sector to also back it with private investment, if they don't have the educated and trained staff on the ground to even be able to work for companies that be on the ground, all of these things, so education system, healthcare system, all of these things that private sector need, all of these things end up at, if private sector cannot utilize it, it's worth nothing. And I think that's why it's important, and this is what we lobby for here in Germany as well. If their summits happen, you have to have you have to bring private sector delegations, for example, to bring up these topics, to have engagements, because it's not necessarily about a German private sector or French private sector to speak to the political stakeholders, but bring Egyptian companies together with French, Indian, or German companies. Something will be created there as well, but it's often being totally underestimated, the impact that could create, and also the impact it has if high-level political stakeholders, and I think that is very important when you speak about the African continent, to mobilize African private sector on a high level. They will follow their political leaders as well, because it's very intertwined on the African continent. And that's why it's so important to have those engagements between the governments and to really use it also to shed light on the obstacles or the opportunities that private sector has on the ground.
So aid to trade is the private sector?
Yes.
Okay. Now we move to the solutions round. We've talked about the problems, we've learned about what is working, what is not working. How do we move forward? Because for me, a big theme that is coming across is balancing the national, the individual, against the regional, the continental. You talked about the difficult times that we are in, how diplomacy has to change. How should we concretely change it? At least looking at it from the regional perspective and from the AU. How should we move on from today?
Thank you very much. If I can give sort of very short recommendations of how we can move forward with these Africa summits. So first and foremost, we don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to African positions. There are plenty of well-established African positions out there, and we don't need every summit we go to think about how we're going to approach this or that topic. And that includes a reform of the UN Security Council. There is a clear position, an African common position on reform of the Security Council. We don't need to discuss it every time we go to a forum like this. There is something to be said about making these summits more precise and more focused. Obviously, much of the focus needs to be on private sector engagement. But if that's not the case with whichever partner, if there's another topic of mutual interest that could be more relevant, then we could do that too. But these wide-ranging summits that cover everything and on the face of the planet, perhaps not the most effective forum to tackle these things. I saw on the map the number of countries that we've had these summits with. I think there were others where there was engagement not at the summit level, where it was either ministerial or at the expert level. And I think that is because at some point in time there was fatigue with some of these summits, some of these Africa Plus summits, and there were real questions about its efficacy. Just because we held a summit last year or 2 years ago does not mean we need to repeat it every single year, because honestly that puts, as a diplomat personally, puts a lot of pressure on very limited resources that a lot of African countries have to do all of these different engagements throughout the year. So it is important as the African continent to assess how efficient these summits are and the need to continue them, and at what level they need to be continued, and what kind of engagement needs to happen. It could remain at the head of state level, or it could be at foreign ministers level, or probably more effectively could be at line ministries level, so it's ministries of investment or ministry of trade with the private sector.
Thank you. So less is more. And to you, Rose, back to the sectorial focus on climate change, just transitions, climate finance, big ticket items. How should African partners engage differently to garner more influence and impact? And back to your issue of implementation from these summits.
One of the things that we should notice is decisions are made at different levels, and say, for example, you'll find Africa will be represented in G77. I was there in Bonn. And when the climate finance roadmap was being discussed, everyone who talked from the developing countries was saying, we concur with what the G77 concluded. So that's one area where decisions, consensus is built on some certain aspects. So also the informal grouping like the G20, where we have AU sitting down with the same countries that they have had these summits with. I think it will be imperative for it to see the direction that the G20 kind of discussions move and the kind of things that these countries that we are taking into the summit also agree with. Why I'm saying that is because when you look at the multilateral, bilateral, these lateral things, you'll find that decisions at different spaces need to tie up at a certain level. So therefore, whether we choose that AU is going to be the guiding factor in terms of the agenda that we want to do with the summits, it could be the best place for one to say, can we have a kind of a tool? I like your tool, yeah? That's what I'm talking about, the monitoring tool. Can we monitor what is it that we are discussing with all this, and then see how we pull everything together such that we don't have, we don't look like we are jumping all over with the same issue. So I think that having a monitoring framework would help, but where that monitoring framework would be placed, maybe under the AU, NEPAD kind of a thing, tracking what is going on with the what we'd call the flagship projects and how interest has come in. Maybe that is one way that I would say would help. But the second thing which has come from the private sector is also to say that we need then to create, as we go for these discussions, we need to ask ourselves whether we are creating an environment or the discussions are allowing us to create an environment which helps us to see the private sector coming in. And this goes beyond just the internal country kind of investment policy, but also asking ourselves, are we at par with what maybe AU, NEPAD is doing with its framework, and also at the G20? Because if that is not aligned, then it makes it very difficult for one to really deal with the risk that private sector look at. So you can have very sweet words and talk about it, but if you are not also following to see whether the environment within which you are discussing this matter for implementation comes in, then you may find that it was all hot air, but it cannot be implemented on the ground. But the last thing I also want to talk about, I know he talked about the youth, that AU has is doing well as far as the youth is concerned. But in the climate change space, I think we still need to do more. And as we do the summits, we need also to look for ways of creating spaces for the youth. If you look at the UNFCCC structure, it's top-down. So you have a structure that comes from top to down, trying to say this is the way we want to engage with the youth, and the expectation is that then from bottom up, you should see the voice of the youth going up. But in these spaces, you'll also find that we are doing actually very retro in terms of supporting that voice of the youth, in terms of supporting their initiatives, in terms of funding their participation in many of these spaces. I've checked some of those documents for the mappings, and I've not seen any discussion on what we are doing with the youth, apart from Japan, which was discussing the Niger, something in the Niger, but it doesn't say anything about how it is going to start to support the startups, which I would, startups even in climate action, which I would see as the entry point that such a negotiation should go to in terms of supporting the youth, the asset that we are looking up to in Africa. Sorry.
Thank you for bringing in the youth angle as well. I want to come back to you about accountability in diplomatic circles. Someone makes you a promise. How do you get them to fulfill that promise within the context of Africa Plus One summits? You talked about the political obstacles, beyond, and also the institutional obstacles, but how do you get your diplomatic partner to fulfill the promises they've made in the Africa Plus One Summit context?
Thanks. I think it goes back to your point about the private sector. I think within the African context, the private sector normally is not involved in policy making, especially foreign policy making. Whereas diplomacy, unless there is a crisis, really is about, in the main, economic and commercial diplomacy. I once some time worked for Global North representation in South Africa. And I remember I was talking about other things that have nothing to do with economics and commercial stuff. And my boss then said, we are here for economic issues. And the interaction between the private sector and the embassy was very close. It was really extremely close, but that reflected also at the domestic front, how the private sector was involved in foreign policy making. So what we can do is to improve and to have on board the private sector as an interest group in terms of foreign policy. So once we have these agreements, and we bring them together also in these summits, so that once the political leaders, like you said, at a high level, once they're finished, then it's the private sector that talks to each other. When we get back to our capitals and there's no delivery, you also have the private sector guys coming on board to also demand for the delivery of those promises, because the difference between the private sector and at least political heads at a high level is that the private sector is very much driven by concrete outputs. So I think that will be important to as a solution. I think what is also important is to kind of also have Africa strategies with partners. Normally these partners that we engage with, if you go to their capitals, they will have, let's say, a Japan-Africa strategy. It's on our side, we need also to have those kind of strategies where we also kind of highlight some of the main issues we want. Let's say in Africa, US strategy, where we say as a continent, how do we engage with the US? And once we have a summit, a leader summit, we know we are also speaking in one voice. And we then have sort of mechanisms within the system to say, how do we follow up on some of these issues? But the other thing is that we also need to be proactive. So we also must be the ones also calling for these summits, so that we also actually put our agenda on the summit. And like you said, we then see who is going to rock up. Usually those who rock up are the ones that we can then say there's good faith here. Then we know we can have the confidence to follow up. Because sometimes it's difficult to follow up on something that was said when you were a visitor. It's a bit, awkward in a diplomatic sense also, to be following up on things that were promised when you kind of didn't ask for them. Also, we need to kind of institutionalize these summits. And within that institutionalization, I think maybe that's also where this tool comes in, because you're then able to say, and the partners also should know that you have institutionalized this, and you have a M&E tool around it, so that if it's not there's no delivery, you can hide behind the mechanism. You can hide behind the M&E tool that they know when they were making the promises, to say, remember with this thing that we said we'll use this to follow up on this. We see there's still an X here and X here, there's no ticking. So I think we should kind of have a much more follow-up mechanism. And of course we need to caucus before we go to these summits. I'm not sure currently where this caucusing would happen, because besides the EU-AU summit, I don't know the other one that is kind of institutionalized at that level. So it would be good if there is a lot of caucusing before these summits, so that there is a common position. And normally when you caucus, you also reduce the list of stuff that is on the agenda. You then focus on things that you know can be can be delivered. I think I'll end there, but I think the real driver of this, in my view, should be the private sector. Thanks.
Kadi, over to you, the private sector as the engine of economic transformation.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, and we hear this a lot, the state creating an enabling environment. Bring it home, make it practical. From where you sit, what does that look like? And how should that happen? Because we don't want the government side disengaging after these summits. So from where you sit, what is practical? Bring it home for us.
For a government to understand that, for example, I like to use the example of Ghana. There was a lot of hype around Ghana, and there's a very strong engagement on all levels with the Ghanaian government. There's also private sector engagement in Ghana, from Germany, for example. And all of a sudden, everybody spoke about Ghana, everybody wanted to go to Ghana. And it was portrayed as this place where doing business is easy and you can invest there easy and you have the partners, you have the institutions. It's not that easy to do business in Ghana. When you speak about setting up a business, like just on paper, it is easier in Nigeria than it is in Ghana. The investment that you have to bring into Ghana is way harder than it is in Nigeria. So we have this example of Ghana where they did it right in terms of diplomacy. There was created awareness around Ghana. Companies, German companies sitting in Germany would put on the news and see different ministries, chancellors, whatsoever going there and creating, there's interest. I saw on the news and they went there and I want to check out what is happening. At the same time, the foreign direct investment from Germany into Ghana didn't really grow as much, even though the interest and the exchange and delegation trips also from private sector were a lot. So Ghana has yet to fulfill this. We have to change something about our Investment Act. And these are the small things. If a company has to bring €1 million into your country, it is hard for them to make that decision. Lower the investment barriers. So these are, and if you just have to ask 10 companies, you have to ask Afrika Verein, you have to ask the German Chambers of Commerce, the answer, you'll have it very quickly. So the interaction with private sector and preparation of summits is the one thing, and enabling environment is often relatively easy. And I would say this is something that maybe we can ask for, that you already mentioned it. Don't, only because you did it last year doesn't mean you have to do it next year already. Maybe we hold governments accountable in saying what you promised us last time has to be fulfilled, at least 80%, or you have to explain why you couldn't fulfill the last 20% before you come up with the next promises and with the next agenda for the next forum, because there will be continuous development, and of course, if you agree this is an area we have to work on, you will not know all the challenges that you will face. At the same time, there are some steps that you can take and really put pressure and your attention on the specific topics that you have already agreed to. So that is something that I would say needs to happen, and I can also tell you private sector is very tired of these summits, very, very tired of the summits. And they rather go around it now and say no, they're not gonna attend it anymore, or even try to be there. So that is I think a threat. And the other thing where I say maybe it's practical, because some things are not even regulatory framework within the countries, but infrastructure, for example. What if the African Union or African governments, may it even be regions, say, let's concentrate on the interconnectivity of our region or our continent. Imagine the impact that would have if Nigeria goes to a summit in Japan or Kenya goes to a summit in India. They all speak about integration, regional integration, or interconnectivity of the African continent. May it be energy infrastructure, may it be road, trains, whatsoever, may it be healthcare infrastructure. Because if you look at the individual summits, Malawi will ask you to build a pharmaceutical production facility, but also will South Africa, Mozambique, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. So this is an issue. Everybody is asking the private sector somehow for the same thing, and there is something that needs to happen on the African side. There are specific topics, for example, production, really local productions will not be established in 5 countries in the same region. That's just a fact. But what if SADC comes to Japan and talks to private sector stakeholders and says, this is what we need in the region to establish and make sure that people are healthy and fed and have interconnectivity. What can you give us, and where do you believe which of the countries would be the best fit for you? I think these are the starting points. I think to always speak about the whole African continent is tricky. At the same time, speaking from a German perspective too, if the African continental free trade area is something that would be pushed within Africa Plus One summits, this is something that could help private sector all over the world, and especially also German private sector that is always working from different hubs in order to be more active on the continent and see the African continent actually grasp the potential that is there in theory.
Awesome. I want to go back to something that you said about the risk that the private sector faces. What advice do you have for the private sector players and the group of people that prepare the private sector to participate in these markets? Because I believe we need a nuanced understanding of risk as it pertains to emerging markets and African markets and, say, risk in Germany. How do we strike that balance? And you also mentioned the private sector is fatigued with the summits, unless we know why we can't engage differently. So if you can shed more light on that as well.
On the risk side, I think this is where diplomacy plays a major role, because if Germans hear about the African continent in terms of political environment just because of crisis and wars and all of these things, and there are too little focus on, for example, the economic and business success stories that are happening on the ground, not even by German companies, but just because the economies are super innovative and interesting. I think this is something that is very important, because if we speak about multilateralism, it's a lot about, okay, the world is giving Africa money because they need it, because of healthcare crisis or because of infrastructure needs, all of these things. So that already frames a wrong picture. So if one could think that within the conception of the summits, and maybe also focus and say, we're going to take some of the risk, or say more, the risk is not as high, because the perceived risk and the actual risk on the African continent are two completely different things. And if you talk to private sector that is active, they will tell you that. If you speak to politicians outside of Africa, they will probably not often say that the risk is not high, or that the perceived risk is higher than the actual risk. So they will speak about the potential and the potential and the potential, which gives everybody outside and private sector the feeling, okay, we have to put in the work, because it's just the potential. It's not an actual opportunity that I can grasp now. And that is, at the end of the day, what private sector is looking for. So that is my maybe input on the how can we talk about the risk, maybe also differently in different aspects. What was your second point?
The summit fatigue.
The summit fatigue. I'm trying to be politically correct. Because we also do events, and for example, the Compact with Africa Summit that happens in Germany once in a while is also one of our babies and something that but it's politicians speak about business and just invest there as if it's nothing. And they don't understand the actual challenges because they don't interact with private sector enough. So private sector, they are asking private sector to be there, and CEOs are being mobilized or trying to be mobilized, companies are mobilized to be in the room. But at the end of the day, they go out of the conference, they go out of the summit and say, I was in the room and my name was there, but I didn't get anything out of it. And also after, I've been knocking on your doors for years to get some attention for the issue that I have with my investment in a specific country, and you have ignored me. I'm not going to come anymore. Or I'm proposing projects and Development Corporation is taking it over. I'm proposing a project that I could invest something if the governments would take some risk, if the governments would help African governments to create an enabling environment. At the end of the day, it's other structures that are taking over. So there is really disappointment in these summits, in the actual momentum that they can create. COP is an example. A lot of our members say they don't go there anymore. They have to go, but the team has shrunk maybe from 50 people to 10. And that shows you the relevance for the business-to-business interaction is really not there, because it's between the summits. There's no work being done to actually create an enabling environment for the investment.
Thank you very much. Now we will open up to questions. Any questions in the room? We start in the room and then we'll move online. Show by hand, the gentleman will come to you with a microphone. And it will be helpful if you can state the panel member that you wish to answer your question.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Schüttler from GIZ. I have one question, and unless I missed it and you addressed it. So we talked about Africa +1 summit. So it's Africa meeting a whole continent, meeting each time one country. So I would love to hear your reflections about how this asymmetry impacts these summits. So is this something that is beneficial to Africa, to actually meet Indonesia, to meet South Korea, to meet them all individually, but being a continent on the other side? Or would African countries prefer the DRC to have a summit with the US? And then, yeah, maybe you can, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I want to hear yours.
We'll discuss the thoughts over the reception. We can take 2 more questions and then we give the panel the opportunity to respond. Second question. That's the...
Hi, I'm Quentin Jalla from the BMZ. Just to expand on your question, could you also give us your thought on EU-AU or EU-Africa at large summits, just to complement yours?
Super, we'll give the opportunity to the panel to respond. Karim, do you want to kickstart?
Thank you very much both for your questions. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's perhaps worthwhile to think about that the format of these summits was created in a time a while ago, and that things have changed. So the relative weight of the African continent today is not what it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago, vis-a-vis not just individual countries, but other regional groupings as well. And that is why, perhaps, as I mentioned in my last comment, that some of these summits have been downgraded from summits to ministerial or even high-level events, and some of them haven't carried on past the first time of trying to do it. So I think it's a very, very legitimate question, and we do need to reconsider this format. Perhaps like with the AU-EU, that's a much more established format, and it deals partly with trade and investment, but not nearly as much as it should. But it's more of a political one, and one that could be more understood. And engagement, say, with the US or with China, with FOCAC, or with Japan, these are long-lasting things with some follow-up mechanism to it. So that's that. But others perhaps need to be reconsidered. You're absolutely right.
Rose?
Yeah, just attempting to. I've never attended this summit, so I just assume what goes on. Yeah, but I think what we are trying to look at is this situation where Japan sits back and invites all of you from Africa. Please come to our table. And the question is, we are coming to the table because Japan has looked at interests in Africa, and it feels that all of us have to be on the table. And I think that is where we are asking the question, what then is the agenda? I'm coming from Kenya. What agenda should I have? What is it that Japan is looking for me if I attend or I come to the table? But what if we change and we say, you know what, as Africa, we want to deepen our relationship with Germany. Can AU organize at AU headquarters and call Germany? And the question would be, who sets the agenda, actually? Is it the AU talking about the 2063 and saying that this is where we want to work with you? Or how do we change those conversations? Because I think how the agenda is set matters a lot in terms of how the outcome of it happens. Of course, for AU, I think I've seen quite a lot of very good documentations because there is the one I know is under the EPAS, you know, the European agreement. And with it, then you find that there are those ministerial level kind of negotiations, and of course, the issue is that they take a long time for you to come to a conclusion as far as the agreements are concerned. But in addition to that is that as these things are happening, what you see is also that there will be something else that comes up, which is like at a unilateral level. Say, for example, I need to be reminded whether we have finished the EPA's conversation yet with the EU at the moment. But as we are doing that, now we have this CBAM, right, coming in. So it was not part of this conversation, but it's coming in. And for me, what I feel with CBAM, yes, good idea. Well, let's think about the carbon tariff. Let's see how we can move on with the agenda for climate change. But then the transition period, yes, we are still in the transition period for 1 year, and then it will start in January. So who is setting the agenda for the other? It's actually EU setting the agenda for Africa, that we want you, as you do your products, this is the way we want you to do. So we want to have the carbon tariff, which means that you have to understand, you have to build the capacity for you to know how to do the carbon pricing. And then you also ask yourself, if you are thinking about this in the natural resources, the steel, the aluminium, and iron, and all those kind of things. Initially, if you look at the tariff levels for the various products using the UNCTAD statistics, you'll find that natural minerals, they usually have very low tariffs, the weighted average tariff. But then when you now are starting to bring in the carbon tariff, in itself, it works the same thing. It will actually increase the prices. It will also bring in the aspect of competitiveness. So that is happening in maybe in Africa, it happening elsewhere. But then also it could affect the trading. So this kind of relationships actually sometimes complicates the agenda for Africa in terms of expanding its trade. Trade that is just less than is it less than 3% of the total global trade, and then it brings in more complications on top of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are going to end it here because we've gone well over time. So I encourage us to continue asking the questions and deliberating during the reception. I want to thank the panel so much for making time to share your insights with us. We appreciate it. And in closing, I would invite Sabine Odiahambo, Secretary General of Deutsche Afrika Stiftung, to give the closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's always difficult to be the one speaking after so many experts have spoken and when you're the one standing between the audience and the food. So I will really keep it very, very brief. I would also like to really thank you, dear panelists, for your insights. I think we really gained a lot of insights into the challenges of developing African diplomacy positions. Thank you very much for that, as well as into challenges and opportunities that the current situation, global situation, presents for Africa. I also took note of the fact that the private sector is increasingly growing tired of summits, while, according to the mapping, the summits are actually growing. So I think there's something to address there that we can also take forward to the conversations. I would actually now like to ask the next question there, if that is something that is particular to the German or European private sector, or if there's a difference to other private sectors. So I think that's an open question to also take with us. And I hope, APRI, that you got a lot of insights on how to further develop the mapping tool. I definitely also found the fact of implementing some kind of monitoring tool very interesting, because I think that was a recurring topic here of the question, how much do these summits really bring? And I think if you can integrate that, then we can have a database discussion and see if narratives are right or if they can even be proven wrong. So thank you very much for the tool, and thank you for your continuous work on that. And then, of course, I would like to thank the teams of APRI, of the German Africa Foundation, and of the South African Embassy for putting up this event on short notice. There was a lot of work that went into it, so please also a big applause for the teams of all these three institutions. And before the next storm hits us, let's all rush and have some drinks and food and nice conversations. Thank you very much, and see you again.